When 12 Marines were trapped in a death zone that no modern helicopter could reach, Marine Command called it an impossible mission. Then, Captain Riley Phoenix Martinez fired up her tiny OH-58 Kiowa that everyone called the museum piece, and proved that sometimes the smallest bird can fly where giants fear to soar. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if the story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The California sun beat down mercilessly on Camp Pendleton as Captain Riley Martinez walked across the scorching tarmac, her flight helmet tucked under her weathered arm. At 38, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd seen real combat, but nobody at Pendleton seemed to care about that anymore. All they saw was the woman assigned to the ancient OH-58 Kiowa Warrior parked at the far corner of the flight line, looking like a forgotten relic among the sleek Black Hawks and Cobras. The little helicopter, barely 30 feet long and weighing less than some of the engines on the bigger birds, had earned more nicknames than friends. The Toy, Little Bug, Grandpa's Whirlybird, and Riley's personal least favorite, the Accident Waiting to Happen. She'd heard them all whispered in the mess hall, scrawled on maintenance boards, and spoken openly by pilots who thought their shiny new aircraft made them untouchable. Riley had specifically requested assignment to the Kiowa after returning from her 4th deployment overseas. While other pilots fought for slots in the prestigious Apache and Black Hawk units, she'd quietly put in paperwork for the aircraft nobody wanted. Her commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Derek Walsh, had approved the request with barely a glance and a note that still stung. Training missions only, not suitable for real operations. The truth was more complicated than Walsh cared to understand. Riley had grown up on military bases where her father, Master Sergeant Miguel Martinez, had maintained Kiowas during their golden age in Iraq and Afghanistan. While other kids played video games, she memorized technical manuals and learned to read engine sounds like musical notes. She knew what lived beneath the Kiowa's modest exterior, an aircraft designed for reconnaissance and light attack that could slip into places where larger helicopters would never dare venture. Her mechanic, Staff Sergeant Carlos "Wrench" Delgado, was one of the few people who understood. A grizzled veteran with oil permanently embedded under his fingernails, Carlos had served with Riley's father and treated the Kiowa with the respect it deserved. Every morning, he'd arrive before dawn to perform maintenance checks that went beyond regulation requirements, ensuring every bolt was tight, every wire was secure, and every system hummed with precision. "She's not pretty," Carlos would tell the younger mechanics who snickered at the helicopter's utilitarian appearance. "But she's honest. No computer telling you what to think, no autopilot making decisions for you. Just pilot and machine working together." Across the flight line, the morning briefing was already underway in the squadron ready room. The space buzzed with the confident chatter of pilots discussing their modern aircraft's capabilities, advanced avionics, automated systems, and firepower that could level city blocks. At the center of it all stood Captain Jason Venom Sterling, the base's golden boy, whose Black Hawk could carry twice the payload of Riley's Kiowa and fly twice as fast. Sterling had the kind of easy arrogance that came from never having been truly tested. His aircraft bore no combat scars, no hastily applied patches, no stories written in metal and paint. Everything about him and his helicopter was pristine, perfect, and completely untested by the chaos of real warfare. When Riley entered the briefing room, conversations dipped to whispers. She nodded politely to the duty officer, found an empty metal chair in the back row, and waited. Sterling's gaze drifted to her name tape, then to the flight assignment board where her Kiowa was listed for basic maneuver training, a euphemism for keeping her busy with meaningless flights. "Captain Martinez," Sterling called out, his voice carrying across the room with theatrical authority. "That little bird of yours even capable of real missions anymore, or are we just keeping it around for nostalgia?" Riley kept her voice steady, professional. "She's fully operational and mission-ready, sir." Sterling laughed, turning to address the room like a performer working an audience. "Look, I appreciate military history as much as anyone, but we're running modern operations here. We need aircraft that can carry real loads, provide real firepower, and get our people home safely, not something that belongs in a museum. A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the assembled pilots. Lieutenant Marcus Webb whispered something to his co-pilot that made them both smirk. The duty officer tried to redirect the briefing, but Sterling wasn't finished. "Tell you what, Phoenix," Sterling said, using her call sign with obvious mockery, "prove that Antique can keep up with real military aviation. One flight exercise, you and me. Show us what that toy helicopter can do against a machine built for actual warfare." The room erupted in barely contained excitement. Someone whistled low, others murmured approval, already calculating odds that heavily favored the Black Hawk. She studied Sterling's expression, relaxed, certain, already victorious in his own mind. She understood the psychology perfectly. Make the challenge public, and the target either refuses and loses credibility, or becomes entertainment. She stood slowly, helmet still under her arm, and looked Sterling directly in the eyes. "What kind of exercise did you have in mind, Captain?"
Sterling shrugged as if discussing weekend plans. "Navigation course through the mountain training area. Timed run with precision landing challenges. First aircraft to complete all waypoints and stick the final landing wins." He paused for effect. "Loser buys drinks for the squadron and admits their aircraft isn't cut out for modern military service." Riley nodded once. "I'll meet you at the flight line at 1400 hours. When she left the room, the betting started immediately. Odds ran heavily against her. Sterling's Black Hawk was faster, more powerful, and equipped with GPS navigation systems that could practically fly the course automatically. But as Riley walked back to her Kiowa, she felt something Sterling and his supporters didn't understand. Confidence wasn't about having the biggest, fastest, or most expensive machine. It was about knowing exactly what your aircraft could do, and more importantly, what you could do with it. The little Kiowa had secrets that no computer system could replicate, capabilities that came from decades of combat evolution rather than corporate engineering. Staff Sergeant Delgado was waiting by the helicopter with a knowing smile. "Heard about your little wager, Captain. Want me to prep her for something special?" Riley allowed herself a small smile. "Just make sure she's ready to show them why size isn't everything, Carlos." As the afternoon sun climbed higher over Camp Pendleton, two very different aircraft began their pre-flight preparations. One represented the cutting edge of military aviation, powerful, automated, and intimidating. The other represented something else entirely: experience, adaptability, and the dangerous combination of a skilled pilot with a machine that could do things its specifications never promised. The real education was about to begin.
The OH-58 Kiowa Warrior, sitting on the tarmac, looked deceptively simple compared to the technological marvels surrounding it. While other helicopters bristled with advanced radar systems, computerized flight controls, and weapons pylons that could carry enough firepower to level a small town, Riley's aircraft appeared almost humble. Its mast-mounted sight looked like an oversized periscope. Its slim profile seemed fragile next to the bulky Black Hawks, and its single engine made it look underpowered compared to the twin-turbine giants. But appearances, as Riley had learned over 4 combat deployments, could be deadlier than any missile. The Kiowa's history stretched back to the early 1980s when military planners realized they needed an aircraft that could see without being seen, strike without warning, and disappear before the enemy knew what hit them. While other helicopters were designed to dominate through brute force, the Kiowa was built for finesse. It could hover behind ridgelines with only its mast-mounted sight exposed, providing targeting data for Apache gunships miles away. It could slip through valleys and canyons where larger aircraft would never fit, appearing and vanishing like a mechanical ghost. Riley ran her hand along the aircraft's fuselage, feeling the subtle vibrations as Staff Sergeant Delgado performed his pre-flight inspection inside. Every panel, every rivet, every component had been maintained to standards that exceeded factory specifications.
Carlos treated the helicopter like a vintage sports car, not because it was old, but because he understood that some machines were crafted rather than simply manufactured. "She doesn't look like much," came a voice from behind her. Riley turned to see Chief Warrant Officer Frank Bulldozer Kim approaching, his weathered face showing the kind of skepticism that came from 2 decades of military aviation. Kim commanded respect throughout Camp Pendleton. He'd flown everything from Hueys of the final years of Vietnam to the latest Black Hawks in Iraq, and his opinion carried weight with both enlisted personnel and officers. "Chief?" Riley nodded respectfully. Kim wasn't her enemy, but he represented the institutional thinking that valued newer over better, technology over technique. "Heard about your little contest with Sterling," Kim continued, walking around the Kiowa, with the practiced eye of someone who'd evaluated thousands of aircraft. "Boy's got a point about capabilities. That Black Hawk can carry 12 fully equipped Marines, has redundant systems for everything, and enough firepower to take out a tank battalion." Riley waited. Kim wasn't finished. "Course," the chief warrant officer continued, running his finger along a barely visible repair patch on the helicopter's tailboom, "I also remember a little bird like this one pulling 6 Marines out of a hot landing zone in Fallujah when 2 Black Hawks couldn't get in because of the power lines and narrow streets. That was you, wasn't it? 4th deployment, 2019? Riley met his gaze. "Yes, Chief. Different aircraft, same type." Kim nodded slowly. "Thought so. Read the after-action report. Said the pilot used terrain masking and low-level flight techniques that no computer system could replicate. Also said she flew that mission with engine damage that should have grounded the aircraft." The memory came flooding back. Marines pinned down by sniper fire in a narrow alley, medevac needed urgently, and every conventional helicopter unable to reach them because of obstacles that made normal approaches impossible. Riley had threaded her Kiowa through a maze of buildings, power lines, and communication towers, flying so low that her rotor wash kicked dust off rooftops. The extraction had taken 12 minutes of flying that violated every safety regulation in the book, but all 6 Marines had made it home. "Different war, Chief," Riley said quietly. "Different requirements." "Maybe. But I've been flying for 23 years, and I've learned that wars have a way of making the impossible suddenly very necessary." He gestured towards Sterling's Black Hawk, gleaming in the afternoon sun. "That machine over there is impressive as hell, no doubt about it. But it's also predictable. Every system automated, every response computerized. An enemy who studies it knows exactly what it can and can't do." Carlos emerged from the Kiowa's cockpit, tool bag in hand. "She's ready, Captain. All systems green, fuel topped off, and I installed that little modification we discussed." Riley raised her eyebrow. Carlos had a talent for modifications that weren't exactly regulation, but dramatically improved performance. His changes were always reversible, always safe, and always effective. "What kind of modification?" Kim asked, his curiosity overriding his skepticism. "Nothing fancy, Chief. Just bypassed some of the engine limiters that keep civilian pilots from hurting themselves. Military pilots with proper training can handle the extra power when they need it." Kim's expression shifted from skeptical to interested. "How much extra power?" "About 15% more torque, 20% faster climb rate. Course, it also means the pilot better know what they're doing because the computer won't save them from making bad decisions." Across the flight line, Sterling's ground crew was performing their own preparations. The Black Hawk's turbine engines were already spooling up, filling the air with the distinctive whine of modern military aviation. Sterling himself stood beside his aircraft, flight suit immaculate, helmet polished to mirror brightness. Everything about his preparation looked like a recruitment poster.
Riley's preparation looked different. She meticulously checked every control surface by hand, tested every switch and gauge personally, and spent 15 minutes just listening to the engine's sound. To an outside observer, she might have appeared obsessive or overly cautious,
But combat had taught her that machines could lie, computers could fail, and the only thing she could truly trust was her own senses, combined with properly maintained equipment. "Captain Martinez," Kim said as she completed her walk-around inspection, "mind if I ask you something?" "Of course, Chief." "Why'd you request assignment to this aircraft? You could have had your pick of any helicopter on the base. Hell, with your record, you could probably have gotten any assignment you wanted." Riley considered the question carefully. The honest answer was complicated, involving years of watching technology replace judgment, automation replace skill, and newer replace better. But there was a simpler truth underneath all of that. Because, Chief, this aircraft doesn't fly itself. It requires a pilot who understands flying, not just operating. She gestured toward the Kiowa's modest cockpit. Every decision, every maneuver, every response comes from the person in the seat. There's no autopilot to catch mistakes, no computer to make tactical decisions, just physics, skill, and experience working together. Kim nodded slowly, understanding flickering in his eyes. "And you think that's an advantage?" "I think," Riley replied, climbing into the cockpit, "that in the right situation, the pilot who can truly fly will always beat the pilot who just operates machines." As she strapped herself into the familiar seat, Riley felt the connection between human and machine that no amount of technology could replicate. The Kiowa responded to her touch like a well-trained horse, sensitive to the slightest input, ready to perform maneuvers that existed more in instinct than in any manual. Sterling's voice crackled over the radio, confident and theatrical. "Phoenix, you ready to show everyone what museum pieces can do?" Riley keyed her microphone, her voice calm and professional. "Venom, I'm ready to show you what real flying looks like." The contest was about to begin, but both pilots understood they were competing for more than bragging rights. They were testing two philosophies of military aviation: technology versus technique, automation versus skill, newer versus better. Only one would prove superior. At 1400 hours, half the base had gathered around the flight line to watch what most expected would be a one-sided demonstration of modern aviation superiority. Word had spread through Camp Pendleton like wildfire. The woman with the antique helicopter was going head-to-head with the base's star pilot in his state-of-the-art Black Hawk. Maintenance crews found excuses to work near the tarmac. Administrative personnel discovered urgent business that required them to be outside, and even Colonel Amanda Cross, the base commander, positioned herself at the operations tower with a pair of binoculars. The course itself was designed to showcase everything a modern military helicopter should be able to do. Starting from the main airfield, pilots would navigate through a series of waypoints scattered across 30 miles of Southern California's most challenging terrain. The route included precision hovering over designated markers, low-level navigation through narrow canyon passages, and timed approaches to simulated landing zones with obstacles that would test both aircraft handling and pilot judgment. Lieutenant Colonel Walsh stood beside the operations board, clipboard in hand, trying to maintain an air of official neutrality while clearly expecting Sterling to dominate every aspect of the competition. He'd designed the course himself, incorporating elements that would favor the Black Hawk's superior speed, advanced navigation systems, and powerful engines. "Gentlemen and lady," Walsh announced to the gathered crowd, "this is a standard navigation and precision flight exercise. Both aircraft will complete the same course under identical conditions. Timing starts when they cross the departure line and ends when they successfully complete the final precision landing." He paused, looking directly at Riley. "Any questions about the parameters?" Riley shook her head. She'd studied the course layout and understood exactly what Walsh expected to happen. The Black Hawk would use its speed advantage to reach waypoints faster, its GPS systems to navigate more efficiently, and its power to handle the precision maneuvers with electronic assistance. On paper, Sterling should win by a significant margin. Sterling raised his hand with theatrical confidence. "Sir, just to clarify, are we operating under standard flight envelope limitations, or can we push our aircraft to their actual capabilities?" Walsh smiled slightly. "Captain Sterling, you're authorized to operate within the full performance envelope of your aircraft, as long as safety protocols are maintained."
The question was clearly designed to intimidate Riley. Sterling's Black Hawk could fly faster, climb higher, and maneuver more aggressively than regulation flying typically allowed. He was essentially asking permission to demonstrate superiority through brute technological force. Same authorization applies to both aircraft, Walsh added, though his tone suggested he didn't expect Riley's Kiowa to benefit much from relaxed limitations. As the pilots completed their final preparations, Staff Sergeant Delgado approached Riley's aircraft with a weather report and tactical assessment that went far beyond what regulations required. Carlos had served in enough combat zones to understand that winning wasn't just about following rules, it was about understanding conditions and exploiting every possible advantage. Winds coming from the southwest at 15 knots, gusting to 25, he reported quietly. That'll create updrafts in the canyon sections and crosswinds at the precision landing zones. Your bird handles gusty conditions better, lighter weight, more responsive to control inputs. Riley nodded, absorbing information that Sterling's automated systems might compensate for, but wouldn't necessarily exploit. The Kiowa's sensitivity to wind could be a liability in inexperienced hands, but with proper technique, it could become a significant advantage. One more thing, Captain, Carlos added, his voice dropping to a whisper. That modification I mentioned, it's not just about extra power. I also adjusted the rotor system governors. You'll have response characteristics more like the aircraft you flew in combat. Immediate, precise, no computer delays. Riley understood immediately. Modern helicopters incorporate safety systems that prevent pilots from exceeding safe operational parameters. But those same systems also prevented the kind of aggressive flying that combat sometimes demanded. Carlos had essentially returned her Kiowa to its original, unfiltered performance envelope. Sterling's pre-flight routine looked like a corporate demonstration. His crew chief ran through computerized diagnostics while Sterling reviewed GPS waypoints on his multifunction display. Everything was precise, automated, and completely predictable. His Black Hawk's twin engines provided redundancy and power that seemed overwhelming compared to Riley's single turbine. Riley's preparation looked entirely different. She spent several minutes simply sitting in her cockpit with the engine shut down, visualizing the entire course from memory. She'd flown similar terrain in Afghanistan where GPS signals could be jammed, where electronic systems could fail, and where survival depended on understanding the relationship between aircraft, environment, and pilot judgment. Chief Warrant Officer Kim approached her aircraft one final time before the exercise began. "Captain, mind if I give you some unsolicited advice?" Riley smiled. "Always welcome advice from someone with your experience, Chief." Kim glanced toward Sterling's Black Hawk, then back to Riley. "That boy's gonna fly this course like it's a video game, following GPS coordinates, relying on his systems to tell him what to do. You've got an advantage he doesn't understand." "Which is?"
"You know how to actually fly." Kim's weathered face cracked into the first smile Riley had seen from him. "Don't let him sucker you into flying his fight. Make him fly yours." The wisdom was profound in its simplicity. Sterling would try to win through technological superiority and brute force performance, but the course included elements that couldn't be solved through automation. Judgment calls about wind conditions, tactical decisions about approach angles, and split-second adjustments that required instinct developed through years of actual flying experience. At 14-15 hours, both aircraft lifted off simultaneously. Sterling's Black Hawk rose with impressive power, its twin turbines creating a distinctive bass note that spoke of overwhelming capability. Riley's Kiowa climbed with a different character, lighter, more agile, responding to control inputs with the immediate precision of a machine designed for finesse rather than force. The first waypoint lay 12 miles southeast, requiring navigation through rolling hills that offered multiple route options. Sterling took the direct approach, using his speed advantage to blast across the terrain in a straight line. His Black Hawk covered the distance in just under 8 minutes, arriving at the waypoint with textbook precision. Riley chose a different path entirely. Instead of fighting the terrain, she used it, following natural contours that provided updrafts and wind patterns that helped rather than hindered her progress. Her route was longer in distance but shorter in time, and she arrived at the first waypoint 30 seconds ahead of Sterling, having used half the fuel. Sterling's voice crackled over the radio, surprise evident despite his attempt to maintain composure. "Lucky navigation choice, Phoenix. Let's see how you handle the real challenges." Riley didn't respond. She was already analyzing the next waypoint, a precision hovering exercise that required maintaining position within a 6-foot circle for 60 seconds while dealing with crosswinds and terrain-induced turbulence. Sterling's automated systems would try to compensate for the challenging conditions, but compensation was different from adaptation. As both aircraft approached the hovering challenge, spectators on the ground began to realize they weren't watching the one-sided demonstration they'd expected. The tiny Kiowa wasn't just keeping up with the powerful Black Hawk, it was actually setting the pace. Lieutenant Colonel Walsh studied his stopwatch with growing confusion. According to his calculations, Sterling should have been building an insurmountable lead by now. Instead, the two aircraft were essentially tied, with Riley's supposedly inferior helicopter somehow matching the performance of one of the military's most advanced machines. "Sir," his aide whispered, "are we sure the timing equipment is working correctly?" Walsh nodded grimly. The equipment was fine. His assumptions, however, were being systematically demolished by a pilot who understood that flying was more than just operating advanced machinery. The real contest was just beginning.
The Precision Hovering Challenge separated real pilots from computer operators, and everyone watching knew it. The designated area sat in a natural bowl surrounded by ridgelines that created unpredictable wind patterns, updrafts, downdrafts, and swirling currents that changed direction without warning. Automated flight systems could compensate for steady conditions, but the chaotic air currents in this location required constant manual adjustment and an intuitive understanding of how helicopters responded to atmospheric disturbances. Sterling approached the hovering point with the confidence of someone who'd practiced this maneuver countless times in simulators. His Black Hawk's advanced flight control systems immediately began compensating for wind conditions, making micro-adjustments to rotor pitch and engine power that human reflexes couldn't match. The aircraft settled into position with mechanical precision, holding steady within the designated circle while his computers fought against every gust and current. Riley's approach looked entirely different. Instead of fighting the wind, she read it, using slight changes in her aircraft's attitude to feel the air patterns flowing around the ridgelines. The Kiowa danced slightly as she settled into position, but the movement wasn't random. It was responsive, like a surfer reading ocean swells. Within seconds, she'd found the sweet spot where natural air currents actually helped her maintain position with minimal control input. 60 seconds starts now, Walsh announced over the radio. Sterling's Black Hawk held position through brute computational force, its systems working overtime to counter every atmospheric disturbance. Fuel consumption increased as the engines constantly adjusted power output, and the pilot's workload remained high as he monitored multiple displays showing wind speed, direction, and system performance. Riley's Kiowa seemed to float in place with almost organic grace. She'd found a pocket of relatively stable air and learned to work with the natural forces instead of against them. Her fuel consumption remained minimal, her control inputs were subtle and precise, and she actually appeared relaxed as she maintained perfect position. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Chief Warrant Officer Kim watched through binoculars with growing amazement. "Jesus," he muttered to himself, "she's not just holding position, she's making it look easy." At the 30-second mark, the wind conditions suddenly shifted. A thermal updraft from the sun-heated valley floor created a swirling pattern that would challenge even experienced pilots. Sterling's automated systems responded immediately, increasing power and adjusting control surfaces to maintain position. But the constant corrections created a visible wobble in his aircraft's stance. Riley felt the wind change before her instruments registered it. Years of combat flying had taught her to read atmospheric conditions through subtle vibrations in the airframe, slight changes in engine sound, and the almost imperceptible shift in how her controls responded to atmospheric disturbances. When the thermal hit, she was already adjusting, using the updraft to her advantage while making control inputs so small they were barely visible to observers. 45 seconds, Walsh announced, his voice betraying slight surprise that both aircraft were still maintaining position. Sterling's crew chief, monitoring from the ground, noticed troubling indicators on his portable diagnostic tablet. The Black Hawk's engines were running hot from constant power adjustments, and the flight control computers were showing stress indicators from the demanding hover requirements. Modern helicopters were designed for efficiency and automation, not for prolonged operations in challenging conditions that required constant manual adjustment. Riley's aircraft showed no signs of stress. The Kiowa had been designed for exactly this type of flying, extended operations in hostile environments where pilots needed to maintain position despite adverse conditions. Her engine temperature remained stable, fuel consumption was minimal, and her control responses stayed crisp and immediate. 15 seconds, Walsh called out. At that moment, a sudden downdraft created by wind shear between the ridgelines hit both aircraft simultaneously. Sterling's Black Hawk dropped nearly 10 feet before its systems could compensate, the automated flight controls fighting desperately to regain position. Warning lights flashed across his instrument panel as the computers struggled to process the rapidly changing conditions. Riley felt the downdraft coming through subtle changes in air pressure and the sound of wind moving across the terrain. When it hit, she was already compensating, using collective pitch and cyclic control to ride the downdraft like an elevator, maintaining her position within the circle with adjustments so smooth they appeared effortless. Time, Walsh announced. Sterling's Black Hawk was back in position, but barely. His fuel consumption had increased by 30% during the hover. His engines were running at elevated temperatures, and his own stress level was clearly visible in the tension of his body language. Riley's Kiowa sat in perfect position, exactly where it had been for the entire 60 seconds. Her fuel consumption had actually decreased during the exercise because she learned to use natural air currents to support her aircraft's weight. Most importantly, she looked completely relaxed, as if the challenging hover had been nothing more than a routine parking maneuver.
The gathered spectators fell silent as they processed what they'd witnessed. The supposedly superior Black Hawk had struggled through an exercise that the obsolete Kiowa had handled with apparent ease. More troubling for Sterling's supporters was the realization that this wasn't a fluke. Riley had demonstrated superior pilot skill and aircraft management under exactly the kind of conditions that military helicopters regularly encountered. Lieutenant Colonel Walsh stared at his stopwatch and performance notes with growing confusion. According to every metric that mattered, Riley had outperformed Sterling in the precision hovering exercise. Her time was perfect, her position accuracy was flawless, and her resource management was dramatically superior. Sterling's voice crackled over the radio, attempting to maintain his confident demeanor despite obvious frustration. "Nice flying, Phoenix. Let's see how you handle the speed and navigation segments." Riley keyed her microphone calmly. "Ready when you are, Venom." But as both aircraft prepared for the next phase of the exercise, everyone watching understood that something fundamental had shifted. The contest was no longer about modern technology defeating obsolete equipment. It was about two different philosophies of flying being tested under real conditions. Colonel Amanda Cross, observing from the tower, turned to her aide with a troubled expression. "Get me Captain Martinez's service record. I want to understand exactly who we're watching." The aide nodded, already sensing that this demonstration was revealing capabilities that had been overlooked or underestimated. Riley Martinez wasn't just a pilot assigned to an old helicopter. She was a combat veteran whose skills had been developed under conditions far more demanding than any training exercise. As the next phase of the competition began, Sterling's technological advantages were becoming less important than Riley's experiential ones. The Black Hawk's computer systems could process information faster than any human, but they couldn't replace the judgment that came from years of flying in situations where mistakes meant death. The real education was just getting started, and everyone watching was beginning to understand that they had seriously underestimated both the pilot and her supposedly obsolete aircraft.
The next phase of the course would take both aircraft through Devil's Canyon, a narrow passage between towering rock formations that had been carved by flash floods over millennia.
The canyon was barely wide enough for a Black Hawk's rotor diameter, with walls that rose 300 feet on either side and created wind patterns that could slam an aircraft into solid rock without warning. Military planners used it specifically to test pilot skill under conditions where automated systems provided little assistance and where split-second decisions meant the difference between success and catastrophe. Lieutenant Colonel Walsh had included this segment expecting it to showcase the Black Hawk's superior power and stability. The narrow confines would theoretically favor the aircraft with more engine redundancy and stronger structural design. What he hadn't considered was that sometimes smaller meant more maneuverable, and sometimes experience mattered more than engineering specifications. Sterling approached the canyon entrance with visible confidence, his Black Hawk's twin turbines providing reassuring power reserves as he began the descent into the rocky passage. His aircraft's radar altimeter and proximity sensors painted a detailed picture of the surrounding terrain on his multifunction displays, while GPS navigation showed his exact position relative to the canyon walls. Every piece of technology was working perfectly, giving him precise information about his environment. Riley's approach looked deceptively casual. She'd flown through similar terrain in Afghanistan, where canyons provided concealment from enemy observation, but also created deadly traps for pilots who didn't understand how geography affected aircraft performance. As she entered Devil's Canyon, she wasn't relying primarily on instruments, she was reading the terrain itself, watching how shadows fell across the canyon walls, observing dust patterns that revealed wind direction, and listening to subtle changes in her engine sound as air density fluctuated. The first mile of the canyon passage went smoothly for both aircraft. Sterling maintained perfect centerline positioning using his GPS guidance, while Riley flew a slightly weaving path that seemed less precise, but actually followed the optimal air currents flowing through the rocky corridor. Both helicopters made good time, and observers began to expect another close finish to this segment of the competition. Then, the canyon narrowed.
The Kiowa danced through the turbulence like a leaf in a storm, but a leaf guided by an expert hand that understood exactly how to use the chaotic air currents to maintain control. Riley's control inputs were so smooth and precise that observers watching from outside the canyon couldn't even tell she was fighting severe turbulence. Sterling's struggle was visible from miles away. His Black Hawk lurched and pitched as he fought to maintain control, finally managing to stabilize his aircraft through brute force, maximum power, full control deflection, and systems working at their absolute limits. He emerged from the wind shear zone with his helicopter intact, but his confidence severely shaken. Riley emerged from the same turbulence looking like she'd been flying through calm air. Her engine temperatures were normal, her fuel consumption remained efficient, and her aircraft showed no signs of stress. Most impressively, she had actually gained time during the turbulence section by using the air currents to increase her ground speed. Chief Warrant Officer Kim, monitoring the radio frequencies, heard Sterling's labored breathing over the communications channel and understood exactly what was happening. The young pilot was discovering the difference between operating a machine and truly flying one. His advanced helicopter could do amazing things, but only if conditions remained within its programmed parameters. Riley's aircraft could do fewer things, but it could do them under any conditions because it responded to pilot skill rather than computer programming. As both aircraft exited Devil's Canyon, the scoreboard told a story that stunned everyone watching. Riley had not only matched Sterling's time through the challenging passage, she'd beaten it by 47 seconds while using significantly less fuel and placing far less stress on her aircraft. Lieutenant Colonel Walsh stared at his timing equipment in disbelief. According to everything he understood about helicopter performance, what he'd just witnessed was impossible. The inferior aircraft with the supposedly less capable pilot had just outperformed military aviation's most advanced technology under the most challenging conditions possible. Colonel Amanda Cross, still observing from the tower, turned to her aide with a grim expression.
Get me everything. Captain Martinez's complete service record, her training history, and her combat reports. I have a feeling we've been seriously underestimating someone who shouldn't have been underestimated. The final phase of the competition was still ahead, but everyone watching understood that they were witnessing something that would change how the military thought about aircraft capabilities, pilot training, and the relationship between technology and skill. Sterling's voice crackled over the radio, strain evident despite his attempt to maintain composure. "Nice flying through the canyon, Phoenix. Ready for the final challenge?" Riley's response was calm and professional. "Ready when you are, Venom." But as both aircraft approached the last waypoint, a precision landing under simulated combat conditions, Sterling was beginning to understand that he wasn't just competing against an obsolete helicopter, he was competing against a level of pilot skill that his training had never prepared him to face.
The final challenge was supposed to be a routine precision landing exercise. Both aircraft would approach a designated landing zone, touch down within a marked circle, shut down engines, and restart for immediate departure. It was designed to test pilot accuracy and aircraft handling under time pressure, the kind of skill that military helicopters needed for inserting troops or evacuating wounded personnel from contested areas. But as Riley and Sterling approached the final waypoint, Staff Sergeant Carlos Delgado's voice crackled urgently over the emergency frequency, cutting through the routine exercise with words that would transform everything. "Base operations, Priority 1 emergency traffic. We have a real-world crisis situation developing." Lieutenant Colonel Walsh grabbed his radio with irritation, assuming some mechanical issue was interrupting his carefully planned demonstration. "Ground control, this is exercise control. We're in the middle of a timed evaluation. Can this wait?" "Negative, sir. We have 12 Marines trapped in a survival situation. Immediate extraction required." The words hit the operations center like a physical blow. Colonel Amanda Cross pushed past her aide to take control of the communications herself. "Ground control, this is base commander. Report situation status immediately." Carlos's voice, normally steady and professional, carried an edge of barely controlled urgency. "Ma'am, Marine Force Recon Team Bravo was conducting mountain warfare training in the San Bernardino National Forest when an unexpected avalanche fit their position. They're trapped on a narrow ledge approximately 200 meters up a cliff face. Weather conditions are deteriorating rapidly, and they have multiple casualties." Riley and Sterling, both monitoring the emergency frequency, immediately broke off from their exercise and began climbing toward the coordinates Carlos was broadcasting. The precision landing challenge was forgotten. 12 Marines were in mortal danger, and every second counted. "What's the tactical situation?" Colonel Cross demanded. "Ma'am, the trapped personnel are on a ledge that's approximately 15 feet wide and 30 feet long. The cliff face above them is unstable. More avalanche debris could come down at any time. Below them is a 400-foot drop into rocky terrain. Weather Service is reporting deteriorating conditions with high winds and possible snow squalls moving in." Walsh grabbed the meteorological report and felt his stomach sink. Wind speeds at the rescue site were gusting to 40 knots with unpredictable directions caused by the mountainous terrain. Visibility was dropping rapidly as cloud cover moved through the area. Most critically, the temperature was falling to the point where helicopter engines could ice up and fail without warning. "Sir," his aide reported after consulting aircraft status boards, "we have 2 Black Hawks and 1 Apache available for immediate launch. But what? The rescue site is in a narrow canyon with vertical walls. Our larger helicopters can't get close enough to the ledge for extraction. The rotor wash from a Black Hawk would actually increase the avalanche danger." Colonel Cross studied the topographical maps with growing horror. The Marines were trapped in a location that seemed designed to defeat conventional rescue attempts. The approach angles were too steep for normal helicopter operations. The surrounding terrain created wind patterns that would challenge even experienced pilots. And the unstable snow conditions meant that any downdraft from helicopter rotors could trigger another avalanche that would kill everyone on the ledge. Sterling's voice came over the radio, tight with professional concern.
Base operations, this is Venom. I'm 15 minutes out from the coordinates, but I need to know, what's the landing zone situation? Carlos responded with the information that would change everything. Venom, there is no landing zone. The Marines are trapped on a narrow ledge that's accessible only by vertical extraction using hoist operations. Maximum rotor clearance is approximately 25 feet from the cliff face. Sterling fell silent as he processed the implications. His Black Hawk, with its 50-foot rotor diameter, couldn't safely approach within 40 feet from the cliff face. Even if he could somehow manage the approach, his rotor wash would create downdrafts powerful enough to blow the trapped Marines off their precarious perch or trigger the avalanche that would bury them completely. Riley's voice cut through the radio silence, calm and professional. Base operations, this is Phoenix. Request permission to attempt rescue operation. Lieutenant Colonel Walsh's response was immediate and dismissive. Negative, Phoenix. This is a real emergency requiring our most capable aircraft and experienced crews. Continue to base and prepare for standby operations. Sir, Riley replied, her voice carrying a tone that made everyone listening pay attention. With respect, I believe my aircraft may be the only one capable of performing this rescue. The radio frequency erupted with competing voices, Sterling arguing that his Black Hawk had superior power and payload capacity, Walsh insisting that obsolete equipment shouldn't be risked in life-or-death operations, other pilots volunteering their aircraft for the mission. Colonel Cross cut through the chaos with command authority. All stations, maintain radio discipline. She paused, studying the tactical situation with the analytical mind that had earned her command rank. Phoenix, explain your assessment.
Riley's response was measured and professional, but it carried the weight of combat experience that couldn't be replicated in simulators. Ma'am, the rescue site requires an aircraft that can approach within 15 feet of a vertical cliff face, maintain stable hover in high winds and turbulent conditions, and extract personnel using hoist operations without creating dangerous rotor wash. The OH-58 smaller rotor diameter and lighter weight make it the only aircraft on base capable of safely executing this mission. She paused, then continued with words that would be remembered for years throughout the Marine Corps. Additionally, ma'am, I have extensive experience with high-altitude rescue operations in similar terrain from my deployments in Afghanistan. I've extracted personnel from cliff faces, mountain peaks, and confined areas where larger helicopters couldn't operate. Sterling's voice came over the radio, grudging respect mixed with obvious frustration. Phoenix is right about the aircraft capabilities. My Black Hawk can't get close enough to execute the rescue. Lieutenant Colonel Walsh stared at his tactical displays in disbelief. The exercise he'd designed to demonstrate Sterling's superiority had just revealed that only Riley's supposedly obsolete helicopter could save 12 Marines from certain death. Colonel Cross made the decision that would define her career. Phoenix, you are authorized for immediate rescue operations. All other aircraft will provide support as directed. As Riley turned her Kiowa toward the mountains, where 12 Marines waited in desperate conditions, she understood that everything had changed. This wasn't about proving the worth of an old helicopter anymore. It was about using every skill she'd learned in 4 combat deployments to bring American servicemen home alive. The real test was about to begin, and failure wasn't an option.
Riley pushed her Kiowa through the mountain passes at maximum speed, the small helicopter threading between peaks that rose like stone monuments against the darkening sky. Behind her, Sterling's Black Hawk followed at a distance, ready to provide communication relay and emergency support if needed, but unable to participate in the actual rescue due to its size limitations. The weather was deteriorating faster than meteorologists had predicted. What had started as clear mountain air was now filled with swirling snow squalls that reduced visibility to mere hundreds of yards. Wind speeds were increasing beyond the safe operating limits for most aircraft, and the temperature was dropping toward the critical point where ice formation could cause catastrophic engine failure. Phoenix, this is base operations, Colonel Cross's voice crackled through the static-filled radio. Latest weather update shows conditions at the rescue site are approaching minimums for helicopter operations. Wind gusts to 50 knots, visibility dropping below 500 feet,
temperature falling to -15°C. Riley acknowledged the report while mentally calculating the implications. Most military helicopters would be grounded in these conditions. The combination of high winds, poor visibility, and icing potential created a perfect storm of aviation hazards. But the OH-58 had been designed for exactly these situations, built to operate in conditions that would defeat larger, more complex aircraft. Base operations, Phoenix. Request direct communication with the trapped personnel. Roger, Phoenix. Switching you to Ground Team Bravo frequency. The voice that answered was tight, with cold and stress, but maintained the professional discipline of Marine Force Recon. Phoenix, this is Gunnery Sergeant Mike Torres, Team Bravo leader. We have 12 personnel on a ledge approximately 15 feet wide, 30 feet long, 4 casualties, 2 with suspected broken bones, 1 with possible internal injuries, 1 unconscious from head trauma. Riley processed the tactical situation rapidly. 12 men plus equipment meant multiple hoist cycles, each one requiring her to maintain perfect position against increasing wind while exposed to avalanche danger. The casualties would require careful handling during extraction, adding time and complexity to an already dangerous operation. Gunny, what's your assessment of the ledge stability? Ma'am, we've got maybe 2 hours before hypothermia becomes critical for the casualties. The ledge seems solid, but there's loose snow and debris above us. Any significant rotor wash could bring the whole mountainside down on our position. This was the critical factor that eliminated conventional rescue options. A Black Hawk's rotor wash would create downdrafts exceeding 60 miles per hour, easily enough to trigger an avalanche or simply blow the Marines off their precarious perch. Riley's Kiowa, with its smaller rotor system and lighter weight, could generate the precise downwash needed for hoist operations without creating lethal wind conditions. Gunny, I'm approaching from the southeast. Mark your position with signal mirror if you have one. Roger, Phoenix. Marking now. Through the swirling snow, Riley caught a brief flash of light from the cliff face. Using that reference point, she began her approach to the most dangerous helicopter operation of her career. The terrain was worse than the briefings had indicated. The narrow canyon walls created a wind tunnel effect that accelerated air currents to dangerous speeds, while the surrounding peaks generated rotors and downdrafts that could slam an aircraft into solid rock without warning. Worse, the unstable snow conditions meant that every sound, every vibration, every change in air pressure could trigger an avalanche that would kill everyone involved. Riley reduced power to minimum levels and began a slow, careful approach that used terrain masking to avoid the worst wind conditions. Her years of combat experience had taught her to read mountain flying conditions through subtle cues. Changes in engine sound as air density fluctuated, variations in control response as wind patterns shifted, and the visual indicators that revealed safe approach paths through dangerous terrain. At 200 feet from the cliff face, she could see the trapped Marines clearly. They were huddled together on a ledge that looked impossibly small and exposed, with wounded men lying motionless while their teammates tried to provide shelter and warmth. The sight of American servicemen in desperate conditions triggered every instinct Riley had developed through 4 combat deployments. Gunny, I'm approaching your approach. Keep everyone as low as possible and away from the cliff edge. My rotor wash will be minimal, but the wind conditions are unpredictable. Roger, Phoenix. We're ready. Riley began the most delicate flying of her career. The Kiowa had to be positioned within 8 feet of the cliff face to allow the rescue hoist to reach the Marines. But the margin for error was measured in inches. Too close, and her rotor blades would strike rock. Too far, and the hoist cable wouldn't reach. Meanwhile, wind gusts were trying to push her aircraft in every direction, and the downdraft from her rotors was stirring up loose snow that could obscure her vision at any moment. Staff Sergeant Delgado's voice came through her headset, monitoring from the base. Phoenix, your engine parameters look good, but you're operating at the edge of the performance envelope. How's your fuel situation? Riley glanced at her gauges. The combination of high altitude, cold temperatures, and precise hovering was consuming fuel faster than normal operations. She had enough for the rescue, but margins for error were shrinking rapidly. Fuel is manageable for planned operations. Beginning hoist deployment.
The rescue hoist extended from her aircraft like a mechanical lifeline, its cable unreeling toward the trapped Marines. But as the first wounded Marine was secured in the rescue harness, A sudden wind gust caught Riley's helicopter and pushed it toward the cliff face. Years of combat flying took over. Riley's control inputs were so smooth and precise that the correction appeared effortless, but she just prevented a collision that would have killed everyone involved. The Kiowa settled back into position as if nothing had happened, maintaining perfect stability while the first casualty was hoisted to safety. First casualty secure, Torres reported, continuing with wounded personnel. Riley maintained her hover with mechanical precision while fighting wind conditions that would have defeated less experienced pilots. Each hoist cycle took precious minutes, and with every passing moment, weather conditions grew worse. But her aircraft held steady, its smaller size and responsive controls allowing her to make the minute adjustments necessary for safe operations in impossible conditions. As the fourth casualty was lifted to safety, Torres's voice carried new urgency. "Phoenix, we're hearing rumbling from above. The snowpack may be getting unstable." Riley understood immediately. Her rotor wash, minimal as it was, had been disturbing the delicate balance of snow and debris on the mountainside above the Marines. They were running out of time before natural forces made the rescue impossible. "Gunny, we need to expedite the remaining extractions. Can your mobile personnel assist with hoist operations?" "Roger, Phoenix. We'll speed up the process." What happened next would be studied in rescue operation textbooks for decades to come.
The rumbling from above the trapped Marines grew louder, a deep, ominous sound that every mountain warfare specialist recognized as the precursor to catastrophic avalanche conditions. Riley could see loose snow and debris beginning to shift on the slopes above the ledge, gravity and vibration working together to create a deadly cascade that could bury the rescue site within minutes. "Phoenix, this is base operations." Colonel Cross's voice cut through the static with urgent authority. "Weather Service is reporting immediate evacuation recommended for all mountain operations. Conditions are beyond safe parameters for continued helicopter operations." Riley's response was calm, but carried the weight of absolute determination. "Base operations, I have 8 Marines still on the ledge, including casualties who cannot survive exposure much longer. Continuing rescue operations." In the operations center at Camp Pendleton, Lieutenant Colonel Walsh stared at the meteorological data with growing horror. Wind speeds at the rescue site were now gusting to 60 knots, well beyond the safe operating limits for any helicopter. The temperature had dropped to -20 Celsius, cold enough to cause immediate engine icing if Riley's aircraft lost power even momentarily. Most critically, the avalanche prediction models showed a 90% probability of major snowslide within the next 30 minutes. Sterling's voice crackled over the radio from his position several miles away, where his Black Hawk waited as emergency backup. "Phoenix, I'm monitoring your engine parameters from here. Your turbine inlet temperature is approaching redline, and your fuel consumption indicates you're operating at maximum continuous power. How much longer can you maintain these conditions?" Riley glanced at her engine instruments while maintaining perfect hover position against wind gusts that were trying to slam her aircraft into the cliff face. The small turbine engine was indeed running at its absolute limits, but years of combat operations had taught her to recognize the difference between maximum rated performance and actual capability. The Kiowa could exceed its published specifications when operated by someone who understood its true potential. "Venom, I can maintain current operations for another 20 minutes. That should be sufficient to complete the extraction." But as the 5th Marine was hoisted to safety, disaster struck. A sudden downdraft, created when high-altitude winds hit the mountainside and were deflected straight down, caught the Riley helicopter with the force of an invisible hammer. The Kiowa dropped 15 feet in less than 2 seconds, the rescue cable going slack and threatening to tangle in the aircraft's landing gear. Lesser pilots would have lost control completely. The combination of sudden altitude loss, unpredictable wind shear, and proximity to solid rock created conditions that flight training manuals classified as non-survivable. But Riley's combat experience had prepared her for situations where physics and engineering specifications meant nothing compared to pilot skill and aircraft knowledge. She caught the falling helicopter with control inputs so precise they seemed to defy the laws of aerodynamics. Using collective pitch to arrest the descent, cyclic control to maintain position relative to the cliff face, and anti-torque pedals to prevent the aircraft from spinning into the rock wall, she recovered from the near disaster in less than 4 seconds. The Marines on the ledge watched in stunned silence as the tiny helicopter literally bounced back from what should have been a fatal encounter with mountain flying's most dangerous hazard. Gunnery Sergeant Torres keyed his radio with obvious awe in his voice. "Phoenix, that was the most incredible piece of flying I've ever witnessed. How the hell did you recover from that downdraft?" Riley's response reflected the matter-of-fact professionalism that defined Marine Corps aviation. "Gunny, this aircraft was built for conditions like this. We just need to work together to get everyone home." But the downdraft had stirred up more than just Riley's helicopter. Above the rescue site, the delicate balance of snow and debris that had been held in place by cold and stillness finally gave way to the forces of gravity and vibration. "Avalanche!" Torres shouted over the radio. "Avalanche incoming from above!" Riley could see it through her canopy, a wall of white death cascading down the mountainside with the inexorable power of natural disaster. Thousands of tons of snow, ice, and rocky debris were thundering toward the ledge where 7 Marines still waited for extraction. The laws of physics said she had perhaps 90 seconds before the avalanche reached the Marines' position. Standard rescue procedures said she should immediately abort the mission to avoid being caught in the slide herself. Combat experience said that 7 American servicemen were about to die unless someone was willing to risk everything to save them. Riley made her decision in less than 2 seconds. "All stations, this is Phoenix, beginning emergency mass extraction. Gunny, get every remaining Marine hooked to that hoist cable right now. We're taking everyone up together." "Phoenix, that's beyond safe load limits for your aircraft. The OH-58 isn't designed to lift 7 personnel simultaneously. Venom, specifications are for normal operations. This isn't normal." What Riley was proposing violated every safety regulation in military aviation. The Kiowa's maximum hoist capacity was officially rated for 2 personnel under optimal conditions. Attempting to lift 7 Marines, including their equipment and gear, would require the helicopter to exceed its published performance envelope by more than 300%.
But specifications didn't account for combat modifications, pilot skill, and the kind of desperate flying that turned machines into extensions of human will. Riley increased power beyond the maximum continuous rating, pushing her engine into territory that manufacturers warned could cause catastrophic failure. The turbine inlet temperature climbed into the red zone, while engine stress indicators flashed warnings across her instrument panel. On the ledge below, Marines worked with the speed and efficiency that came from years of training for impossible situations. 7 men clipped into a single hoist cable, trusting their lives to equipment that was never designed for such loads, and to a pilot they'd never met, but who was risking everything to save them. "Phoenix, you're showing engine parameters that are off the charts." Carlos Delgado's voice came through the radio from his monitoring station at base. "Those readings indicate imminent turbine failure." Riley's response was barely audible over the howling wind and screaming engine. "Carlos, she's got more in her than the book says. We're bringing everyone home." The avalanche was now less than 30 seconds from the ledge when Riley began the most dangerous lift of her career. 7 Marines, their equipment, and their trust hung beneath her aircraft as she asked a small helicopter to do something that engineering textbooks said was impossible. The Kiowa groaned under the load, its engine operating beyond any safe parameter, its airframe stressed to limits that should have caused structural failure. But 40 years of careful maintenance, combat modifications, and pilot skill combined to create something greater than the sum of its specifications. As the wall of snow and debris thundered toward the now empty ledge, Riley's helicopter climbed away from the mountainside with 7 Marines who had been seconds away from death. The impossible had just become routine. Riley's Kiowa struggled through the thin mountain air with a load that should have been impossible to carry. 7 Marines hung beneath the aircraft in a configuration that violated every safety protocol ever written, their combined weight pushing the small helicopter beyond its theoretical maximum performance envelope. The engine screamed at power settings that manufacturers had never intended, while airframe stress indicators flashed warnings that no pilot wanted to see. But the aircraft held together through a combination of exceptional maintenance, combat modifications, and the kind of engineering overdesign that had made the OH-58 legendary among pilots who understood its true capabilities. Below them, the avalanche that had threatened the Marines crashed into the ledge where they'd been trapped just moments before. Thousands of tons of snow, ice, and rocky debris obliterated the narrow platform, burying it under 30 feet of compressed snowpack. If Riley's rescue had been delayed by even 60 seconds, 7 American servicemen would have been entombed in that white grave. "Phoenix, this is base operations." Colonel Cross's voice carried a mixture of awe and concern. "Confirm you have successfully extracted all remaining personnel from the rescue site?" "Base operations, Phoenix. All 12 Marines extracted successfully. 4 casualties stable and receiving first aid. Proceeding to base for immediate medical evacuation." The radio frequency erupted with voices, ground controllers expressing disbelief, medical personnel preparing for incoming casualties, and pilots from across the base acknowledging what they'd just witnessed. Riley had not only completed an impossible rescue, she'd done it under conditions that should have defeated any helicopter in the military inventory. But the mission wasn't over yet. Riley still had to fly her overloaded aircraft through deteriorating weather conditions back to Camp Pendleton, where medical teams waited to treat the injured Marines. The return journey would test both her skills and her aircraft's durability in ways that peacetime operations never could. Sterling's voice came over the radio as his Black Hawk fell into formation alongside Riley's struggling Kiowa. "Phoenix, I'm showing your engine parameters are still in the danger zone. Turbine inlet temperature is holding steady in the red, and your rotor system is showing stress indicators that suggest potential failure." Riley glanced at her instrument panel, which looked like a Christmas tree of warning lights and caution indicators. Under normal circumstances, any pilot would immediately land and shut down the aircraft to prevent catastrophic failure. But normal circumstances didn't include 12 Marines whose lives depended on reaching medical treatment as quickly as possible. "Venom, engine parameters are elevated but stable. Aircraft is controllable and maintaining forward flight, continuing to base." What she didn't mention was that her fuel consumption had increased by 40% due to the excessive power required to maintain flight with the overload. Quick mental calculations showed she had perhaps 20 minutes of fuel remaining, enough to reach Camp Pendleton, but with no margin for error or delays. Staff Sergeant Delgado's voice came through her headset from the maintenance monitoring station. "Captain, I'm reading stress indicators across multiple aircraft systems. The hoist mechanism is showing signs of structural fatigue, and your transmission oil temperature is climbing toward critical levels." Riley processed the information while making constant control adjustments to keep her overloaded aircraft stable in the turbulent mountain air. Every system on the Kiowa was operating beyond its design limits, held together by careful maintenance and the kind of engineering margins that military specifications built into aircraft expected to operate under impossible conditions. "Carlos, how long can these systems sustain current stress levels?" "Ma'am, honestly, they shouldn't have lasted this long. But if I had to guess, you've got maybe 15 minutes before something critical gives way." 15 minutes to cover the remaining distance to base, land safely, and get the wounded Marines to medical treatment. It would be close, but Riley had learned during 4 combat deployments that close was often the best you could hope for. The weather continued to deteriorate as they descended from the mountains toward the desert floor where Camp Pendleton waited. Snow squalls reduced visibility to less than 500 feet, while wind gusts continued to buffet both aircraft with unpredictable force. Riley's Kiowa, heavily loaded and operating at the edge of its performance envelope, responded sluggishly to control inputs that normally would have produced immediate results. "Phoenix, base operations. Medical teams are standing by at the landing zone. Emergency vehicles are in position, and we've cleared all other aircraft from your approach path." Base Operations Phoenix. ETA 10 minutes. Request priority handling for 4 urgent casualties. As Camp Pendleton appeared through the swirling snow, Riley faced her final challenge of the mission. Landing an overloaded helicopter in high winds required precision that left no room for error. Too fast, and the aircraft could bounce or roll over. Too slow, and the excessive weight could cause a hard landing that would injure the Marines she'd risked everything to save. She approached the landing zone with the methodical precision that had kept her alive through hundreds of combat missions. Power settings calculated to the exact percentage needed for controlled descent. Airspeed managed to provide stability without excessive energy at touchdown. Control inputs smooth and deliberate despite the aircraft's reluctance to respond normally.
At 50 feet above the ground, a sudden wind gust caught the Kiowa and pushed it sideways toward a line of parked vehicles. Riley corrected with anti-torque pedal and cyclic control, bringing the aircraft back to centerline with movements so subtle they were barely visible to observers on the ground. At 20 feet, her engine coughed, a momentary interruption in power that sent warning indicators flashing across her instrument panel. For a terrifying instant, Riley felt the aircraft begin to settle faster than normal as the turbine struggled with the excessive demands placed on it. She increased collective pitch to arrest the descent, drawing even more power from an engine that was already operating beyond its limits. The turbine responded with a sound that was part howl, part mechanical scream, but it continued to produce the power needed for a controlled landing. At 10 feet, everything went quiet except for the whistle of wind and the steady beat of rotor blades. Riley's Kiowa settled onto the landing zone with the gentleness of a bird returning to its nest, the excessive weight finally supported by solid ground instead of mechanical flight. As the engine wound down and the rotor blades slowed to a stop, medical teams swarmed the aircraft to extract the wounded Marines. Riley remained in her seat for a moment, hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline and physical stress of the most demanding flight of her career. Staff Sergeant Delgado approached the cockpit with a clipboard and an expression of professional amazement. "Captain, preliminary inspection shows stress damage to multiple systems, but nothing that can't be repaired. How the hell did you keep this bird in the air with that kind of load?" Riley finally allowed herself a small smile as she climbed down from the cockpit. "Carlos, some things aren't in the technical manuals. Sometimes you just have to trust the machine and fly it like you mean it." Behind them, 12 Marines were alive because one pilot had refused to accept the limitations that others had imposed on her aircraft and her capabilities. The impossible rescue was complete, but the impact of what had just happened was only beginning to be understood.
Within hours of Riley's return to Camp Pendleton, word of the rescue had spread throughout the entire Marine Corps aviation community. Video footage from Sterling's Black Hawk, which had recorded the entire operation from a safe distance, was being analyzed by flight instructors, combat pilots, and aviation safety experts who struggled to understand how one pilot in an obsolete helicopter had accomplished what should have been impossible. The medical reports painted a stark picture of what Riley's actions had prevented. All 4 wounded Marines were expected to make full recoveries, but only because they'd received immediate medical treatment. Dr. Sarah Kim, the base's chief flight surgeon, delivered her assessment to Colonel Cross with professional bluntness. "Ma'am, based on the environmental conditions and injury severity, those Marines had perhaps 90 minutes before hypothermia and shock would have made survival impossible. Captain Martinez didn't just rescue them, she saved their lives with minutes to spare." Colonel Cross studied the tactical reports spread across her desk with the analytical mind that had earned her command authority. The meteorological data showed conditions that exceeded safe flying parameters for every helicopter in the Marine Corps inventory except the OH-58. The avalanche timing confirmed that conventional rescue attempts would have resulted in multiple casualties among both the trapped Marines and any rescue crews attempting the operation. Most significantly, the performance data from Riley's aircraft revealed capabilities that contradicted everything the military establishment believed about older helicopter systems. "Colonel," her aide reported, "we're receiving inquiries from Pentagon officials, aviation safety investigators, and training command personnel. Everyone wants to understand how this rescue was possible." Cross nodded grimly.
Schedule a full debriefing session. I want complete documentation of Captain Martinez's tactics, aircraft modifications, and decision-making process. This operation needs to be studied and incorporated into our training programs. But the most important conversation was taking place in the base medical facility, where Gunnery Sergeant Mike Torres sat beside his injured teammates and spoke directly to Riley about what her actions had meant to 12 Marines and their families. "Ma'am," Torres said, his voice carrying the quiet intensity of someone who'd faced death and lived to tell about it, "I've served 3 combat deployments and survived situations that should have killed me, but I've never seen flying like what you did today. You didn't just rescue us, you showed us what's possible when someone refuses to accept limitations." Riley sat quietly, still wearing her flight suit, her hands bearing the small cuts and bruises that came from flying in extreme conditions. "Gunny, that's what we do. We bring Marines home." "Yes, ma'am, but most pilots wouldn't have even attempted that rescue. The conditions were beyond anything in the training manuals." Riley met her eyes directly. "The conditions were exactly what that helicopter was designed for. We just forgot that somewhere along the way." The formal recognition began 3 days later, when General Patricia Hayes arrived at Camp Pendleton with a delegation that included Pentagon officials, aviation safety investigators, and training command personnel. The ceremony wasn't just about honoring one pilot's exceptional performance, it was about acknowledging a fundamental shift in how the military thought about aircraft capabilities and pilot training. Lieutenant Colonel Walsh, who had spent months dismissing Riley's abilities and her aircraft's potential, stood before the assembled personnel with a humility that his previous arrogance made even more striking. "Ladies and gentlemen, 3 days ago, I believed that modern military aviation was about having the newest, most technologically advanced equipment. I was wrong." He paused, looking directly at Riley. "Major Martinez proved that the most important component of any aircraft is the pilot, and that experience and skill can overcome any technological disadvantage." Riley had been promoted to major effective immediately, with assignment as the Marine Corps' chief instructor for high-risk rescue operations. But more importantly, her demonstration had triggered a complete reevaluation of how the military approached aircraft retirement and pilot utilization. General Hayes addressed the ceremony with words that would reshape military aviation policy for decades. "What we witnessed here wasn't just an exceptional rescue operation, it was proof that we've been making critical errors in our assessment of both equipment and personnel capabilities. We've been retiring aircraft and sidelining pilots based on age rather than performance, technology rather than effectiveness." She gestured toward Riley's Kiowa, which sat prominently displayed despite its modest appearance among the sleek modern helicopters. "This aircraft, which some called obsolete, just completed a mission that our most advanced helicopters couldn't attempt. That's not a coincidence. It's a lesson we need to learn." The policy changes that followed would affect every aspect of military aviation. The OH-58 program, scheduled for complete retirement, was extended indefinitely with upgrades that incorporated Riley's modifications as standard equipment. Experienced pilots who had been forced into desk jobs were returned to flight status and assigned to specialized units that emphasized skill over technology. Most importantly, a new training program was established that paired experienced pilots with younger aviators, teaching them that flying was more than operating computer systems. It was about understanding the fundamental relationship between pilot, aircraft, and environment.
Captain Jason Sterling, whose arrogance had started the competition that revealed Riley's capabilities, became one of her most dedicated students. His request for assignment to the new training program came with a personal note that reflected genuine humility. "Major Martinez, I've learned that the most dangerous thing a pilot can have is overconfidence in technology and underconfidence in experience. I'd like to learn real flying from someone who's mastered it." Staff Sergeant Carlos Delgado was promoted to Master Sergeant and put in charge of a new maintenance program that emphasized understanding aircraft capabilities rather than simply following technical manuals. His modifications to Riley's Kiowa became standard upgrades across the entire fleet.
Chief Warrant Officer Frank Kim, whose initial skepticism had evolved into deep respect, delivered perhaps the most meaningful recognition of all during the ceremony's conclusion. Major Martinez, in 23 years of military aviation, I've seen a lot of good pilots and a few great ones, but I've never seen anyone who understands so completely that the machine is only as good as the person operating it. You didn't just save 12 Marines, you reminded all of us why we became pilots in the first place. As the ceremony concluded and the dignitaries departed, Riley found herself alone with her Kiowa for the first time since the rescue. The small helicopter bore new scars from its impossible mission: stress marks on the airframe, wear patterns on control surfaces, and the subtle signs of an aircraft that had been pushed beyond its limits and responded with reliability that exceeded every specification. She ran her hand along the fuselage, feeling the vibrations of a machine at rest, but ready for whatever challenge might come next. The helicopter that everyone had mocked as too small, too old, and too limited had just proven that sometimes the best solution was the one nobody expected. Riley's phone buzzed with a message from Marine Corps headquarters. Major Martinez, report to Quantico for briefing on new National Rescue Operations Command. Congratulations on changing how we think about aviation. As she walked away from her aircraft, Riley understood that the real victory wasn't in proving her helicopter's worth. It was in proving that experience, skill, and determination would always find a way to overcome the limitations that others accepted as permanent. The tiny helicopter that everyone had mocked had just reminded the entire military that in the right hands, there was no such thing as an obsolete aircraft. And tomorrow, she would begin teaching that lesson to a new generation of pilots who would carry that wisdom into whatever challenges the future might bring. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.